So just know that tonight's webinar is recorded, and we are planning on sharing the recording on the internet. So, you know, if you're not someone who likes to have your face on recordings, you can keep your camera off, you know, and just be aware that everything that we're sharing today will go up on the internet. So, you know, keeping a respectful dialogue and being kind and courteous to everyone, as we always are. Now that I've pressed record, I want to acknowledge that wherever we're calling in from the stolen lands of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. I'm on the lands of the Gimuy, Walabara, Yidinji and Yirrakanji people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I'd like to pay my respects to all of the different places that people are calling in from and the peoples whose country that is, and who have looked after it for millennia. If you'd like to put in the chat or in your little name on your face what country you're calling in from, it's always a really nice way to acknowledge the lands on which we stand. So yeah, paying our respects to all of those elders past and present. Like Claire's just introduced herself in a chat, that's a great example. So thank you all for joining this webinar tonight, Building Renewables to Benefit Nature and Communities. We're going to be running through a little bit of I guess, a summary of the Chalumbin Wind Farm and its recent withdrawal as a proposal. And yeah, particularly why CAFNEC and QCC, you know, were not encouraging of that proposal going ahead for the reasons why. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what is the work that we need to do to keep the transition to renewable energy on track, you know, in the context of some of these developments happening in inappropriate places. So you'll hear from me first, and then you'll hear from Claire at the Queensland Conservation Council. We'll have a couple of things that you could take action on today at the end, but we also are allowing plenty of time for questions because we know that that's a really important part of the dialogue. So if we're talking today and you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat, because Steph's going to keep an eye on the chat and like put those questions into a list that we can come to at the end. Or it might be that you don't think of your question till the end and we can answer it then. So that's how we're going to run tonight. Just while we're presenting, if you can keep yourself on mute while we're presenting, just for the background noise, make it easy for everyone to hear. And then when it's question and answer time, we can you can unmute and mute yourself. So if we're getting background noise, we might just mute you while we're going, because we have the powers to do that. But we certainly want to hear from everyone at Q&A time. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get into it. Great. Can everyone see my screen now? Excellent. So we've already got past that bit. And yeah, I did an acknowledgement earlier, but just acknowledging traditional owners from across the country. So I guess the Cairns Far North Environment Centre, along with a number of different community organisations from Far North Queensland, including folk on the call tonight, spent a number of years now campaigning about the Chalumbin Wind Farm. And tonight I'm just going to run through what we learnt from working on the Chalumbin Wind Farm and what were some of the reasons that we were really concerned about where it was proposed and the impacts that it would have. So CAFNEC first heard about the Chalumbin Wind Farm about 3 years ago now. And we actually took a bit of time to develop a public response or opinion on the wind farm. And that was because we have for a very long time campaigned for the transition to renewable energy, because we believe that it is a really important solution in the emissions reductions needed to limit climate damaging emissions. But we also have campaigned for a long time about stopping development that has inappropriate impacts on nature. And this is one of those examples where we saw the intersection of those two pieces of advocacy really intersecting with each other. So I guess the first really important thing to know about the Chalumbin, or the Wooroora Wind Farm as it's now known, was that environmental values were not considered in the siting of this project. So from the very early engagement we had with Arc Energy, we said, this is a very interesting place to propose a wind farm in the buffer zone of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, where there's, it is a cattle grazing property, and that that there is impacted parts of that landscape, but there are really, significant intact sections of wet sclerophyll forest, threatened species habitat, and it is also sitting right between the World Heritage Area and Yorka Reserve, which is a really significant wildlife reserve that sits on the other side of it. So we asked the proponent what was considered in the siting of this project, and they told us it was proximity to the transmission lines, availability of land tenure, and availability of a wind resource. But environmental sensitivity wasn't something that was considered in those early days. And, CAFNEC, along with the Wet Tropics Management Authority, really raised concerns about, the fact that those early considerations needed to be made, from 3 years ago. And, as we predicted that the impacts to, threatened species and significant environmental matters were probably not likely to be minimized in a way that was acceptable. And so, it's I guess important to know that as it stands, developers by practice haven't considered environmental sensitivity on siting. So the other context that this came in was the recent, when this wind farm was first proposed, Caban Wind Farm had just been approved. And we were seeing, you can see some of the images on the left there of the clearing that happened in association with the Caban Wind Farm. That was a clearing footprint of about 129 hectares, and the Chalumbin Wind Farm in its original form was proposing to clear around about 1,000 hectares of forest. And so you can see the footprint here. This is the Caban Wind Farm footprint, and this is the scale of the original proposal for Chalumbin. So we had real concerns about the scale of clearing because it was sited in an area with lots of remnant vegetation, not in a previously cleared sort of area. But not only that it was going to clear 1,000 hectares, but the cumulative impact of that clearing was quite stark. So the number of different threatened species that used those forests as habitat was quite numerous. And so cumulatively, it's a lot bigger area that's, sort of cleared. So if you imagine, knocking down one home for one family, or knocking down an apartment building that houses a lot of families, that one bit of forest is not just hosting, the like spectacled flying foxes, but there also might be, other things like red goshawks in there. And so there was a bunch of foraging and habitat that was going to be affected. And particularly we had concerns about the spectacled flying fox, the northern glider, and the magnificent brood frog, which were all set to have quite a lot of areas cleared for this proposal. There's also some really significant discrepancies between what was described in the state assessment and in the federal assessment. So we're really concerned about, the kind of the project changed hands and changed consultants between the state assessment and the federal assessment. So in some ways that's to be predicted, but it sort of highlighted some of the inadequacies in the assessment at the state level. And the other really big thing was that although threatened species are considered, iconic species weren't considered. So when you're, looking at matters of national environmental significance, it's usually looking at threatened species, protected areas, those kind of things. But we know that the World Heritage Area has some really important iconic species that are listed in association with its outstanding universal values. The most upsetting one was the Lumholtz tree kangaroo. There was those animals have really high site fidelity, which means they stay in a couple of trees, or for most of their lives, or in a pretty contained area. There was a mother and baby, found on site in the state assessments process, and that area was to be cleared and have a turbine put exactly where that camera trap was going to be. So we knew that iconic species weren't being assessed in the EPBC Act, which is, as we all know, that law has a number of failings, and this was highlighting one of them. In the original project, the offsetting was really, really inadequate and quite, I think we all know that offsetting has had a lot of issues for a long time, but certainly the offsets that were being proposed, for this development were pretty wild, in that there was major development happening through the offset zone. And as you can see here, this was going to be the offset zone. They were going to put the yellow lines here, just saying, oh, we're just drawing a line around where the transmission, like where the turbines will be put in. And these are all the roads that have to connect where the turbines go in. But they were saying that the project was going to offset this area, and that would provide connectivity between Coomba and Yorka Reserve. But if you put a whole heap of roads and wind turbines through the offset area that's supposed to be, increasing connectivity, it's pretty widely obvious that it wasn't. So it actually increased fragmentation, because that particular area of the property is not where the cattle is grazed, so it's fairly intact area. And so we had some really big concerns about not only the clearing that was happening, but the inadequacy of the offsets. The other issue, which is really an issue for decommissioning across all energy proposals, particularly mining and coal mining and those sort of developments as well, is that decommissioning, is blowing out in its cost analysis across the country. But particularly for decommissioning wind farms, if you have to clear all the roads to bring the turbines in, even if you rehabilitate them, when you decommission, you have to clear those roads to bring the turbines out again. And we really weren't seeing any consideration in the rehabilitation plans of there was no detailed decommissioning plan at all. And that was a real concern for us. So then the project got scaled down. And we saw this area here, which I'm circling with my mouse, which was stage 2. The second, so there was 2 properties that were, that the developer was trying to negotiate with. Stage 2 actually had, a lot less issues. It was further from the wet tropics. It wasn't in the buffer zone. It didn't impact any wet sclerophyll forest. There were still impacts to magnificent brood frogs, but there was no iconic species found there, and the other threatened species impacts were significantly less. But the developer couldn't secure a landholder agreement in that area. So when they decided to scale down, they went to stage 1, which still saw it in the buffer zone of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. This purple area was then what they proposed as their offset area, which still had, which is a large patch of wet sclerophyll forest, which is contiguous with the national park. And there was, even though there was an offset area, they were still going to develop turbines in it. And additionally, they just reduced this offset area down the bottom, which is the area I was showing you before, but it still is increasing the disruption to connectivity between Yorka Reserve and Coomba National Park. So the scaled down proposal still failed to, address really key concerns we had about the development of turbines within the offset area, which was also wet sclerophyll forest, which is a really significant ecotone in the buffer zones of the World Heritage Area. there was still quite significant clearing of threatened species across this development site. There still wasn't a decommissioning plan. And something I haven't talked about earlier was that because this development would put roads into the buffer zone of the national park, we were concerned about the increased vector for fire and weeds. And while there was weed assessments done, there wasn't fire assessments done. And the response from the developer was that was because the wet tropics doesn't burn. And anyone who lives up here knows that the wet tropics does burn under conditions. And we saw some really significant burning that happened up in Cape York after the the cyclone and some of the impacts there. But we've also seen burning of wet tropics forests in the Atherton tablelands under dry conditions. So we really had some significant concerns around this development. But we didn't just campaign to say that this development wasn't well sited and shouldn't go ahead. We really started working with organisations like the Queensland Conservation Council, other regional conservation groups, the Renewable Energy Alliance, a lot of other organisations like ACF or the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Wilderness Society, the Friends of the Earth, and a lot of the groups that have been campaigning for a long time for renewable energy, to really say that our vision is for a restorative renewable energy industry that increases biodiversity and empowers First Nations people and regional communities. And a lot of people say, and I'm just going to go over this very briefly. We've on the CAFNEC website, you can go to our webpage on this, and we've got a whole sort of 2-page document on what the priorities for achieving this vision are. But really at the core of it is good planning. We know that we really need our planning and environmental laws to be reviewed so that large-scale development having poor impacts to nature has been happening for a long time, and we need a review of those laws, and we'll talk about that more later. But in the how do you actually get an industry that increases biodiversity is, our hilltops around Queensland have 7 meters per second of wind. That's really what industry traditionally looked for because it's the most profitable wind speed to capture for wind farms. What we're saying is sacrifice that 7 meters per second, go to where you've got 5 meters per second or 6 meters per second on already cleared land. You can, then take that land, put development there and rehabilitate stream banks and gullies, do revegetation, increase threatened species habitat, connect corridors potentially if that works out. And that would actually increase biodiversity outcomes overall if you're taking previously impacted land, putting these projects on there and then adding, rehabilitation projects. So, it's not easy and it won't happen in a moment, but it is possible. And we've always been about fighting for what we think is possible. And I think just to, sort of say climate change is a wicked problem and solutions to wicked problems always have perverse outcomes. So, when we say a wicked problem, it means that climate change is something that is so big and so multifaceted that no one solution is going to fix it. There's no silver bullet. And every solution that you try is probably going to have perverse outcomes. And so you have to keep trying to do these things and identifying what are the perverse outcomes and how do we work around them. So we know that renewable energy is the most sensible sort of option for emissions reductions associated with energy production because it's ready to go now, it's affordable, and it's something we know how to do. And there's going to be perverse outcomes of that because it involves large-scale development. But we can, sort of do the things I was talking about before, but also have distributed energy systems and other solutions, which I'll let the others talk about. And I'm going to finish up because otherwise I'll talk forever. But I think the important thing in all of this is really being clear about who we are as a movement and staying connected through these really difficult conversations. Now, I put Eleanor Roosevelt's quote in there, which was relevant to a certain time when big change was happening. But, you know, I think this is one of the biggest revolutions that our society is going to see in this century, is this change in our energy sector and this you know, and addressing climate change. But there's a lot of people who are making a lot of money and getting a lot of power from, you know, extending the life of fossil fuel energy, and also, you know, other corporate interests. And the number one way that they succeed in remaining in place is by dividing communities like ours. And so I think that, you know, it's really important to, and you've all come tonight, so thank you. But I think, you know, in this transition, we need to be really aware of, you know, how we working together, how we're staying focused on our shared energy and shared, you know, where we do agree, because we're never going to all agree as a movement, because, you know, there's a bunch of climate solutions I don't necessarily agree with, you know, like the export market, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to find ways to, you know, collaborate across the movement and stay connected. So I think that was just the last thing I wanted to say. And I'm going to hand over to Claire from QCC and put myself on mute, and she's going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll have Q&A.
Thanks, Lucy. Lucy has done a great job of using an illustration of one of the really tricky situations that we're facing in Queensland as we try to transition. I want to take a bit of a step back now and talk about Queensland's progress, you know, how we're doing and like what we need to do better to get this, to improve the renewable energy rollout. So just to start with like a snapshot of how the renewable energy transformation is going in Queensland, where we've got targets to reach 70% renewable energy by 2032 and 80% by 2035, which were legislated by the Labor government, but unfortunately not with support from the LNP opposition recently. So that's kind of up for debate in the October election. But in Queensland, we have the advantage of owning most of our coal-fired power stations, so able to control their closure. And Queensland's renewable energy generation has increased rapidly. In the last 5 years, it's nearly doubled, from renewable energy providing about 15% of our energy in 2018-19 to now being edging up towards 30%. So I think we're at 28% in the last year, which is a combination of rooftop solar, of which Queensland is a leader, and large-scale renewable energy. Go to the next slide, Lucy. And this isn't yet having a big impact on land use in Queensland. So this is our assessment of land clearing in 2020-21. There's a massive lag of when SLAT's, the statewide land cover and assessment and tree cover survey is released, and the most recent one is 2020-21, and it showed 350,000 hectares of land was cleared in Queensland, predominantly for cattle and grazing. We estimate about 5 solar and wind farms were under construction in that period, and the clearing, any clearing associated with them, was under infrastructure, so about 0.5% of the clearing that happened in that year. And if we go to the next slide, we can see our kind of forecast of if we build wind farms to reach the 80% renewable energy target in the Energy and Jobs Plan. Based on the projects that are currently proposed, we think that the total direct clearing impact would be about 5.5% of that 350,000 hectares that we're currently clearing every year. So that's just to put in context within Queensland. The other important factors in that context are that, like, us and CAFNEC and most of the environment movement in Queensland is fighting a big campaign to reduce those rates of deforestation because they're incredibly high. We don't want to use that as a cover for other clearing. And the other is about where the clearing is occurring. So as Lucy's outlined, at the Chalumbin site, we saw areas of really high biodiversity and critical for threatened species habitat be impacted. So, but that's, yeah, the context of clearing in Queensland. And if you go to the next slide, as Lucy mentioned, these are really hard problems, and the people that benefit from a kind of climate versus renewable energy, climate versus nature frame is the fossil fuel industry that gets to stay open longer, as we don't have the energy to replace it. So the way that we need to make sure we're talking about the things that will actually provide a solution for us is keeping on pinning the focus on improving our nature laws in Queensland, so that we can have better confidence in how renewable energy will be built. So if we go to the next slide, there's just a quick overview of how wind farms are currently assessed and managed in Queensland. So wind farms are code accessible under State Code 23, which is fairly bland and not up to the scale of this and size of wind farm proposals that we're seeing, and has been under review for more than nearly a year now. So that's one of the key asks that we'll talk about later to accelerate the planning review of State Code 23. For solar, we don't have a state code, so there's no standardized assessment for solar farms, which leaves local councils to assess them. At a federal level, most wind farms and solar farms that will clear native vegetation go through the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act, which we'll talk a little bit more about later as well, but is under review of a disappointing scale and speed as well. And the third main framework is the Renewable Energy Zone development. So this is to guide the development of renewable energy regionally in an efficient and managed way, but is currently lagging behind development. So kind of renewable energy zone planning is focusing around areas where there are already a lot of projects proposed, rather than being able to deliver the regional planning that would actually manage cumulative impacts and allow communities to be engaged in how their energy future looks. So if we go to the next slide, there are a lot of opportunities for improving biodiversity outcomes throughout renewable energy development. This slide is taken from a guideline for better practice that the Renewable Energy Alliance and Energy Charter put together. And you can see all the different options that there are for improving the environmental outcomes from renewable development. So from the system design of, reducing the energy we need using as much locally as we can, to the site selection, to how those projects are planned and incorporate local knowledge, to how they are operated to increase biodiversity under the sites. So there's a lot of potential for good things to happen, and we're committed to working with the industry and government to improve those outcomes. If we go to the next slide, the reason that so committed to working with industry and government is because we do believe it's possible to have a renewable energy industry that also protects our biodiversity and is actually critical to protecting our biodiversity because of the climate implications. So we need to be running a solutions-focused campaign so that we keep centering climate action and keep emissions reduction on track while acknowledging and attempting to fix the problems that we are seeing with the renewable energy rollout. And also we need to be achieving that system change so that it's not down to local communities to be fighting each individual wind farm, because that doesn't lead to good outcomes for the transition, for the environment, or for those communities, obviously. So I think, is Natalie on the line and wants to talk to the EPBC section? Or maybe
Sorry,
not?
folk, our second speaker was getting it on a plane, which was delayed. So she has joined, but she might be in the car. So
Okay.
yeah.
I will just keep
Yeah.
rolling on.
Thanks, Claire.
So the EPBC Act is our flagship environmental laws and has been under intense scrutiny for a long time, since 2020, when it was comprehensively showed that it's not protecting nature. That Morrison government sat on that review, and it wasn't until the 2022 that the Albanese government committed to reviewing and implementing that Samuel's recommendations. But so there was a lot of fanfare and promises of no new extinctions. In April 2024, the government has faced the hardships of actually implementing the reforms that they were interested in, and have scaled back to propose to do two things, one of which is introduce an environmental protection agency, which will increase the enforcement of the EPBC Act, and an environmental information authority. So what improvements that means we'll see under those two laws is the EPA will be able to monitor the regional plans to make sure that they deliver positive outcomes, and the Environmental Information Authority is committed to developing a publicly available mapping tool so that people can see spatially important environmental areas in their region, and understand the potential impact of developments. What we also think is possible to achieve with a campaign that we and many other groups coordinated under the Places You Love Alliance are running is national environmental standards that would set a better baseline of what is acceptable environmental outcomes. And we're still hopeful that the bioregional planning can be progressed to provide that spatially informed understanding of how development should proceed in a region. So I think on the next slide, there's a bit of a illustration of those, the theory of bioregional planning under those national environmental standards. So to set areas that are important for conservation in a region and areas that are more suitable for development. And QCC is doing a mapping project with the University of Queensland at the moment to define what we think is an appropriate methodology for setting no-go zones, so areas that are so important for threatened species or threatened ecological communities that they have to be protected in order to ensure the survival of those species. So this is like whistle-stop tour of renewable energy planning and the federal environmental reforms, but rest assured, this is a long campaign that QCC and CAFNEC will continue to be participating in. And I think on the next slide, we've got some actions that you can take So some of the key things that we're focusing on at the moment is emailing and putting pressure on Megan Scanlon as the Queensland Planning Minister to update the planning code. So that consultation closed more than 6 months ago, and we just really need to see that released as the first step in a broader planning reform. And the other one is to just make sure that all MPs are feeling the heat around the need for the EPBC reforms to happen, and to particularly introduce strong national environmental standards. So Steph's just put the links to those actions in the chat, and I think on the next slide we've also got some QR codes if that's your jam, and it would be great to get as many people telling their MPs and ministers that this is something that we really need to progress. So we'll leave those up there, I think, and go to some questions.
Yeah, I think so. And Natalie, who's joined us late, is happy to help with some questions if there's any specific around the EPBC reforms in relation to the transition. John asked a lot of questions in the chat, but has left, but I think we'll still answer them because it's recorded. He might be listening in, he might have just dropped out. So AEMO has set out a framework for conversion from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. The generation requirements are huge, 9 times our current capacity. So where will the loss of these 200 turbines be sited? So I think that, you know, the question is really pointing to, like, we have to have a really big transition right now. And so every project like this that gets withdrawn or rejected is reducing that energy that's being put into the grid. You know, unfortunately, there isn't enough coordination that the Queensland government's sitting around thinking about, okay, now that these 200 or less on the second, it was 90 for the actual Wooroora station proposal. Now that those 90 turbines aren't going to be feeding into the grid, where will that be coming from? Well, there is a huge number of projects that could fill that capacity. On that particular transmission line, there is other projects like the Upper Burdekin Wind Farm. Unfortunately, the Upper Burdekin Wind Farm also has some really serious impacts on nature, and particularly the Charbins, rock wallaby and koalas. So, you know, I think the question for that particular part of the grid is really difficult because the line between Townsville and Ravenshoe goes straight through the World Heritage Area. And so the land that's available in close proximity to that particular bit of the grid is predominantly national parks or in the buffer zones of national parks. But, you know, I would say that there's a number, you know, quite a few projects that are being proposed across Queensland that, you know, would fill that capacity. And what we would hope to see is that the coordination within the renewable energy zones and the renewable energy zone roadmap that the Queensland government's introduced is where we would see that capacity being filled, where there'll be better coordination of those projects with siting because of the land use planning that's been done in association with those reses. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Steph or Claire, around that.
I think that my answer to that probably bleed into like John's next comment about the time and the urgency that we need to, with which we need to make emissions. And I think that like that is an unfortunate reality that we are facing, and there's very few, if not no, wind farms proposed in Queensland that will not impact some amount of threatened species. So we are, you know, facing uncomfortable decisions about that, and our approach is to, yeah, try to advocate for cumulative impact planning in areas around, you know, well, everywhere, but particularly in those central Queensland and northern Queensland regions where we are seeing a lot of projects proposed, so that there's remnant vegetation and connectivity left, which is possible to achieve through the renewable energy zone and bioregional plan approach.
Yeah, and I think that leads really well into a question from Pamela, which is about the status of the cumulative impact assessments. I think cumulative impact assessments, have not been done well in association with the EPBC Act, and that was really clear in the Samuels review. Natalie, I don't know if you had an update on that, or if you could speak to that.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for joining late. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, great. So the way that the reforms are shaping up to address cumulative impacts is very much through the regional planning approach. And so that's where it's important that we do get these national environmental standards up, one of which will be the standard for regional planning. And that's an opportunity to address cumulative impacts in certain areas. So what we're seeing for Queensland, there are the 3 proposed essentially pilot bioregional plans, and if we get them right in Queensland, they will essentially act as pilot projects for the rest of Australia. So with the just diving into regional planning a little bit more, there will be the development zones and the conservation zones, and there'll be areas of clear, like the conservation zones are areas of clear no-go zones. So at the moment, what we've seen in the draft standards through the various consultations that have happened down in Canberra is that there's still some holes in them, right? And so they're still saying only certain classes of action won't be allowed in the conservation zones, but we're obviously pushing very hard for them to be strict conservation zones that prohibit any form of development that will have impacts on matters of national environmental significance. We've had lots of conversations with the staff who are drafting up these standards about this. They are aware of that. But in terms of, the cumulative assessment, it really will be through the regional planning approach, but then also under the new national environmental standards as well, particularly the one for MNES, the proponent will have to prove that there won't be any impact on those MNES. And so the laws in and of themselves in terms of the reform will tighten things. Like we know now how flawed they are, and there's no hold and it's not working. So the full package of reforms, if delivered this term of government, and that's what we're pushing for because we don't want them watered down any further, will achieve that as well.
Thanks, Nat. And I think that's a really important thing, for why scanning that QR code or following the link to email your federal MP is really important. So the recent announcement we've seen from our federal government isn't a good indication for those reforms coming in this term, this term of government. And so if you follow that link, there's an email there, and you can add in there and you can say, this is really relevant for the transition to renewable energy because we need bioregional planning to be happening. We need it happening soon, and we need it implemented, and we need those environmental standards to make it accountable and those cumulative impacts to be, included in those bioregional plans. And I think, for anyone who's been involved in regional planning in Queensland already, you probably look at the idea of bioregional planning and say, well, we've had regional plans in Queensland for a long time that aren't really having the impact that we want them to have. And so, what we have been doing and what has been happening is looking at what are those mechanisms of accountability that need to be brought into this kind of regional planning that make sure they are measured, that they're accountable, and that someone's answerable to them, because we know that if that doesn't happen, we'll see those same sort of mistakes made again. So, it is a really important time right now to be emailing our federal MPs and also, Tanya Plibersek. But I think, what we've heard is that, the rest of the government needs to hear about how important this is. Tanya Plibersek has her faults, but, she has been pushing for this reform and probably needs her colleagues to hear that message as well. I think I'm just going to go into Deborah's question, which is, rather than industrial wind facilities, why isn't there more attention to rooftop solar? And there's a bunch of detail in there that you can see in the chat. And I think I'm just going to pull up one thing and then I'm going to hand over to Steph, who I think can answer probably this question quite well, or maybe Claire. But there was a moment in time last year where rooftop solar put more energy into our grid than any other form of energy. So, you know, Queensland has has the largest uptake of rooftop solar, but, you know, there's a whole heap of other distributed energy solutions that do exist. So it's definitely an important part. So I'll throw over to Steph, who has a lot of, history on this subject as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. So we can't fully rely on rooftop solar because we do need a diversity of renewable energy to power our system, especially when we get to higher penetrations. So rooftop solar, you know, Queenslanders are world leaders. It's really great. We really support it. But just because it produces energy all at the same time, you do need that diversity. So there are a lot of sites in Queensland where wind blows at night. So that goes a long way to sort of getting us to that 100% renewable sort of system, and means that we need less storage, because if we just had solar, we need, you know, a very large amount of storage, and we already need quite a lot of storage as it is. So yeah, that diversity is really key. But I totally agree with you that rooftop solar and making it available to everyone is super important. So at QCC, we lead the Power Together collaboration, which is a mixture of different groups. There's environment groups, but there's also social service groups and faith groups, and we all come together. And what we campaign on is solutions that have a shared aim, like not only reducing our emissions, but also addressing cost of living. So in that coalition, we campaign for things like solar for social housing and solar for renters, and also energy efficiency upgrades for rental properties, because it's really important that we take a holistic approach to the energy transition. So yeah, looking at how we can minimize our demand, our electricity demand with energy efficiency, but also how can we, you know, generate electricity locally as well. So we are campaigning on all of those different avenues, and it's a really important piece of the puzzle. But unfortunately, we do need large-scale renewables as well.
Thanks, Steph. And I think that really speaks to, you know, what we were trying to highlight before, with this being a wicked problem that doesn't just have one solution. There's so many pieces that we have to work on. And something I wanted to draw out from earlier was, you know, there is such an incredibly large number of proposals happening at the moment. And one of the questions that Tom asked is, what do you think this means for the rejection of the the assessment of the Upper Burdekin Wind Farm under the EPBC Act, which, you know, is quite similar to Chalumbin in many ways. I think, you know, one of the really important things is that, you know, the EPB assessment team looked at the environmental sensitivities of that site and recommended, you know, and the minister indicated she would recommend that it would be rejected. But we know that the EPBC Act doesn't do that in a lot of cases. There's so many developments that have been approved with major impacts, and, you know, the Winchester coal mine, the Adani coal mine, like all kinds of mining and infrastructure development. So let's not be we're not under any pretense that the Chalumbin wind farm, you know, was withdrawn because the EPBC Act succeeded in protecting our nature. There was a very successful campaign that was run that with a lot of submissions. You know, I know that the CAFNEC community put in 91 submissions on that assessment alone. The local natural resource management groups were involved. There was, you know, things coming in from the Wet Tropics Management Authority. The reality is there's a huge number of proposals in North Queensland and Central Queensland, and there's not enough community capacity to campaign on all of these projects. And so I think the thing is that, you know, while as there's a lot of local communities, a lot of people putting in a lot of effort to getting submissions in and to, you know, to keeping an eye on these proposals, like the amount of proposals coming through is only going to continue increasing. And that's why we really need to urgently focus on these planning and nature law interventions, so that we can have a system that prevents poor development from occurring. I'm just going to put a link in the chat because Deborah sort of brought up concerns about the impacts to flying animals. So BirdLife International has this program called Step, which looks at the sensitivities to birds, particularly in different countries. And similar to the work that QCC is doing with the land use mapping and bioregional planning and that kind of stuff to understand where, are the sensitive areas. Step looks at where are the sensitive areas for avian animals, and they are developing work on that for Australia now, which is really exciting. And so, BirdLife has been a really big part for a long time of looking at the impacts to birds and flying foxes and flying animals, from these wind farms, because there are impacts. So, they have some really great resources there as well. Steph, is there any other questions you think we should lift up that I've missed so far?
Can I just jump in on Fiona's comment about native vegetation regulation? Just to say that the way that wind farms are assessed under the Planning Act is through State Code 16, which is native vegetation clearing. So that is designed to be parallel and equivalent to the Vegetation Management Act that regulates projects or development that isn't assessed under the Planning Act. And well, your comment about a lot of grazing clearing that is reflected in slats being regrowth, and like that is true, but the scale of clearing remains. And we like a lot of a significant amount of renewable energy clearing is also remnant. So yeah, that's thanks, Natalie's just put in some context there about the amount of deforestation in Queensland that was remnant forest at about 50,000 hectares, and the amount that we think would need to be cleared to build the renewable energy and jobs plan is around 20,000 hectares to 2035. So that's just the context there.
Yeah, and I think I might actually answer Deborah's question, but just to before I do that, answer around the vegetation laws is like we still have major reforms to happen in our Vegetation Management Act if we're really going to limit clearing in Category X being one of the main areas that happens. And the Wilderness Society and a number of groups continue to lead really important campaigns that QCC is involved in and CAFNEC's involved in. In regards to, I think Deborah's question is really important, is like, is there going to be, what I'm going to sort of draw what she has asked about is like the deaths associated with these, wind turbines, or is really about data sharing. So, a really important part, the Queensland government has some real issues with WildNet right now, which is another really exciting campaign that we've been leading, which is trying to, and, Sheena, I can see on the call, has been a really big part of this work as well, is, trying to ensure that the Queensland government, gets WildNet, which is their database, up to speed and up to scratch and accessible and working. But also, where we talk to industry and they said, oh, well, it's really hard to do cumulative impacts. And then, government saying, well, there's not enough data to, know what is a significant impact. But if developers were required to share the amount of data that they get from the assessments that they have to go through in assessing the impact assessments of their projects, the data that they have to have ongoing for monitoring, there would be a significantly different landscape of information available to us to understand what's going on in Queensland. So that is something that we have been having a lot of conversations about, is like, what is going to, in the future, we would encourage there to be a requirement for developers to do public data sharing on threatened species, because it is a matter of public interest. And I think that, is really important, you know, when it comes to recovery teams. So, for example, you know, just to give one example, because Deborah mentioned Caban, is we were really keen for Caban to have a closer relationship with the Magnificent Brood Frog Recovery Group, and to share their data that they get on their monitoring of, you know, where they're finding that species, and to increase, because one of the biggest problems with that threatened species is a lack of knowledge of their, you know, where they are, their breeding cycles, all of that kind of stuff. But we know that they're where that wind farm is. So, you know, and there's a lot of hesitancy within the development industry to develop community partnerships, to do data sharing agreements. And recovery teams are full of really professional scientists and community members who know how to manage that data in a way that respects, you know, any privacy. So yeah, there's another whole wormhole that you can go down on in how we can really improve this. And I think, you know, we're coming to time, and you know, I think it's really good that the Chalumbin wind farm is not going to have those impacts to nature, but there's a lot of other developments that could potentially have impacts. But additionally, without the transition, the impacts to nature are insurmountable. And so, you know, but it's not reassuring right now, because we haven't seen the release of the planning review of State Code 3. We're seeing the federal government slow down on the EPBC reforms. So, you know, you've come tonight because you're really interested in this, and this is obviously important to you. So I think one of the most important things that you can do today is copy and paste those links, put them in your browser, you know, send the emails, put that pressure on, share it on your Facebook, because unless we keep a lot of pressure on the state and federal government, the reality is that this won't change. And we really, really need the system to change. So I think the really big takeaway tonight is, you know, change doesn't happen because it should. This won't happen well because, you know, because we asked it to. It will be because we made it happen. Deb's saying the link isn't working, but what we'll do is send a follow-up email to everyone who RSVP'd with that information as well, and you'll find it on our social media. So I think we might wrap there, guys. It's been a really great to have you all here, and thank you so much. I can see people clapping. You can take yourself off mute if you want to give a cheer, but you know, it's a hard conversation, but a really important one. So thank you for taking the time tonight.
Thank you, Lucy, and everyone.
Thanks, great talk.